estate is going to receive their income, and that is untrue for spouses. For spouses, there's a certain amount of allocation that can happen with the income in order to make sure that the spouse at home still has what they need. But we're not going to talk a ton about income eligibility because that could be a whole separate class. And we're going to really focus on assets today. So this term Medicaid spend down, again, set the income and functional requirements a little bit aside, know that they exist. For the asset requirements, there's still this idea of you have to have the amount of assets that Medicaid would allow you to have. So, you know, someone can't necessarily just be short on care and in need of care and be on Medicaid. They have to have, you know, a little amount of assets as well. So I'd actually like to start firstly with a married couple. What can a married couple have in assets in order to qualify for Medicaid? Medicaid does distinguish married or single between countable and non-countable assets. So a non-countable asset would be like someone's home. You can have your primary residence for that married couple and it's non-countable. You can also have a certain amount of money set aside for burial arrangements. That's traditionally like $15,000 a person, and you can prepay for some arrangements in physical places like urns and plots and things as well. You can have $1,500 face value life insurance. Otherwise, if the face value is above that, it's countable. And you can have one vehicle total. That's not one vehicle per spouse, it's just one vehicle total. And then the very important distinction between married couples and a single person is the qualified assets of the community spouse or the spouse at home are non-countable. So what that means is the community spouse is that term for whatever spouse is at home. They get to keep all of their retirement. So where that's going to be is someone's IRA, 401k, Roth IRA, all those things are non-countable for the community spouse. So as to how much that helps you will be completely case dependent. It'll depend for a married couple who needs care first, if they were to both need care, who had more significant retirement accounts. And where this can oftentimes cause trouble for clients is, you know, men do tend to need care first. And if we're looking at the type of, you know, just to generalize a population and age, I have a lot of clients where at this point it's starting to equalize out a little bit more, but I have a lot of clients where the husband will have more in retirement than the wife, and then he traditionally needs care first. Which means that only the wife's retirement is off the table. So you understand it's whoever needs care, whoever would need to be on Medicaid, their retirement is fully countable. It's just the retirement account of the spouse who's at home and not receiving care or not trying to be on Medicaid that's non-countable. So that's going to be a real shift for people depending on that breakup of those assets. And again, that's going to even be like IRA annuities are countable as qualified accounts. It's anything that's that pre or post-tax qualification. Otherwise, everything else is going to be a little bit of a calculation. So again, set aside the house, set aside the retirement of the community spouse, some money for burial, the vehicle, and kind of ignore the life insurance unless you have some sort of small policy. And then all the bank accounts, investments, retirement accounts of the spouse receiving care, anything else that you can really think of, additional properties, you know, hunting land, I don't know what it is. All of those things are going to be countable. And what Medicaid does is they kind of add all those countable things up, and they say that if you're at 50,000 or below in countable assets, the community spouse gets to keep all of those assets. If you are between 50,000 and $154,140, I think this year. Yes, sorry, I was looking down, those change every year. Then you're going to have up to about $154,000 in countable assets. What happens though is if you're between 50,000 and 154,000 is they add all those up and then they divide it. So if you had $200,000 in countable assets, you'd have to spend down to $100,000 in countable assets. If your half was over 154,000, then you get to keep the maximum. You don't get to keep more than that. So how they calculate that is again somewhere between 50,000 and 154,000 of the half of the countable assets, and if you're above that, the most you can spend down to is 154,000. For a single person, and again, if you have any questions on that, I can slow down and answer a little bit more. I use the expression sometimes with clients that it seems complicated or it feels complicated because it is complicated. But again, what they're trying to do is gauge between countable and non-countable and differences between a married couple and a single individual. With a single person, the home is still non-countable, but I am more concerned with the estate recovery component of Medicaid. So just understand that Medicaid in Wisconsin has an estate recovery program where once that person would pass, if they were on Medicaid, estate recovery has like first claim against anything they were allowed to have. So that what that would mean is traditionally, if a single person passes and they own something like a home that was non-countable while they're on Medicaid, the state is going to be able to come and, potentially place a lien against it, or the family is going to have to pay off whatever it is that they provided out in benefits. So sometimes you hear about, mom or dad went into a nursing home and then they passed and the nursing home came and took their house. That's not the nursing home. It's a state. There is a state recovery program because that person had access Medicaid benefits. So for a single person and, potentially for a married couple, you just want to be really aware of that lien that can be placed or that amount that can be owed to the state because someone was on Medicaid. And again, it would be whatever they've actually paid out in benefits, which would be the difference between the income and cost of care. Will also depend on how long someone had received benefits for. So the home with all its caveats. You can also have the less than $1,500 face value life insurance, otherwise they count the cash value. You can have the money set aside for very ill, and you can have one car. There's no sort of retirement account exception there. Basically everything else that person would have, their retirement, their bank accounts, any other properties, anything else would be considered countable and has to be spent below $2,000 before that person would receive assistance in qualifying for Medicaid. So that's the spend down. That's what people are talking about is you can't gift away your assets with Medicaid. I know a lot of times people, when they're planning around care costs, they're trying to get things out of their names, out of what's considered available. But Medicaid says you can't just gift away what you have. If you give something away, meaning that you don't receive fair market value in return, even a sweetheart deal on something, they can penalize you for that. And that's not to say that they come and take that money back. They just say right now for every $9,599.80, which we'll just say $96,000, is a month of care Medicaid won't pay for. And you can't toll that penalty unless you're otherwise eligible. So you have to be really careful with gifting. There's no safe harbor for gifting. I know a lot of people talk about that this year, $18,000 per person per tax year that you can gift away without needing to file a gift tax return. Those are IRS rules. IRS and Medicaid play by different rules. They're different agencies for better or worse. So there's no safe harbor for Medicaid. There are some exceptions, but you want to be really, really careful about any gifting that you do. And traditionally, we don't really recommend some gifting strategies. We more kind of do trust-based, so that way we get better tax strategies, points of control, all those sorts of things. But again, you don't want to be gifting anything away. When people are talking about spend down, what they're doing is they're actually spending that money on stuff mom or dad would need until the point that they qualify, which depending on how much money someone can have means a lot of time where they're just spending and spending and spending until the point that they would qualify for Medicaid. Now, it's true that sometimes spending down is the right answer for some people. Like if I was to meet with a client and they were, a single person and had we'll say $30,000 in assets. Well, if they spent even 15,000 of those on burial, they'd only have 15,000 to spend down, which believe me, you look at some medical equipment, you can spend that on mom and dad pretty quick. They might be more in the case of looking to be immediately eligible. But a lot of facilities won't actually let someone on Medicaid right away. So part of the balance here is understanding when we would want Medicaid to pay, what are some of the pros and cons of that, and if it's even possible. Not all facilities take Medicaid as a benefit. So you want to be careful to understand, if you or a loved one needs to access Medicaid, if that facility will take you on Medicaid, because Medicaid is a program with the state of Wisconsin, essentially gets like a bulk payer discount. Since they have so many people that they're paying for, they pay less than private pay people do. So for facilities, in order to be, just good businesses, they have to know, okay, well, for this many people on Medicaid, sorry, I'll put my hands up here, this many people on Medicaid, you have this many people privately paying, that way you can offset some of those costs. So if a facility takes Medicaid, which not all of them do, most of them that do are going to have private pay requirements, where they say that, yes, you can go on Medicaid, but we have to have you pay a year, or most commonly in our area, 2 years first before we would take you on Medicaid. So not all facilities will take Medicaid right away. And I want to make sure that you're still maintaining good quality choice and quality of care for as long as you can. I think part of the problem is that if you truly just spend on and spend on and spend on until the point that you're on Medicaid, I mean, you can recognize you're not going to have a lot of money. Like there's that income shift, there's the limitation on assets. And unfortunately, a lot of times having money means having choice. And we had, unfortunately, last January now, the big case that everyone's hearing about is Emerald Bay. They were a facility up in Green Bay that had decided to stop accepting Medicaid. And then the big problem was they had kicked out everyone who was on Medicaid. And I always want to make sure that if you're talking about spend down, that you're doing that in a way where you understand what you're trying to spend down to and the benefit of it in your case, and then maybe also preserve things. So that way, if you are on Medicaid and your facility decides to stop accepting Medicaid, or you were on Medicaid and your facility gets bought out by some new owner and the quality of care just shoots down, or you were, you're in a private room and then you go on Medicaid, and because of that cost difference, you get moved into a shared room. All those things really, part of what we try to talk about with clients is this idea of maybe setting some money aside. We can do prospective planning where we set that money aside 5 years in advance of Medicaid. I don't know if I specifically called out the 5-year look back, which I apologize. I should have maybe explained that a little bit more with the do not gift. But that's a 5-year look back for Medicaid. If we can plan typically 3 to 5 years in advance of care, we can set aside things that you might not necessarily want to spend or might want to have a little bit more control of. Not only so that way, what we set aside is protected from availability and recovery, but to perhaps allow it to be able to supplement you in your lifetime and really kind of stretch those dollars. It depends on someone's goals. But you can do planning for Medicaid outside of a spend down, such as with prospective planning or emergency planning. Especially with emergency planning, what I advise families if they start to have long-term care concerns, or they just want to make sure that they can have some options planning around Medicaid or planning around those long-term care costs, is it's really important to have your powers of attorney reviewed, not just by someone who does estate planning, but by someone who does elder law. Because you may have done your documents initially to help make sure that like your bills are paid and your finances are taken care of. But estate planning and elder law are actually different things. And doing that planning around long-term care tends to lean more on the elder law side. So if you want the ability to do not prospective planning, but emergency planning around some of those costs, we can only do whatever the power of attorney says. So we can be very limited in terms of some of the options that families can have at the time. And that's why even if you think that it's not something you need to worry about right now, it's definitely something where you'd want to have your current powers of attorney reviewed to make sure that they can do everything that you might want them to at the time. And if you don't have powers of attorney, you absolutely need them. You absolutely need them. Anyone over 18 should have them. And that just is what allows someone to be able to help make sure that during your lifetime that you have what you need. And then especially related to that long-term care planning. We have other classes, like we have a wills versus trust seminar where we talk more specifically about wills and trust and powers of attorney coming up, not next week, but the week after. At the DJ Bordini Center in Appleton. So if you'd like to hear a little bit more on wills versus trust powers of attorney, that's absolutely something I'd recommend that you attend. They are essential for someone to have, especially for long-term care planning. But as far as Medicaid eligibility and spend down and where that comes from, again, focusing on more on assets is about getting down to those levels, spending money on things that are not considered gifts or divestments. And while spend down can be the right answer for some people, it's not the right answer for everyone. And you have options besides just spending down. You just need to make sure that you're talking more specifically, probably with an elder law attorney, and that you have the other things that you need in place prior, because you kind of have to need them and have them rather than need them and not have them, if that makes sense to you. Good powers of attorney in place to allow yourself to be able to do that planning. I haven't seen any questions come in. So I'm hoping that everything I'm saying will make sense. Our long-term care book goes a little bit more into detail on this too. And then if you have more questions on wills trusts, especially those irrevocable trusts for long-term care planning, that's something we actually talk about more in detail at our wills versus trust seminar. So, okay, otherwise, without anything else, next week, we're actually doing a webinar on what every power of attorney should know. So that can be really helpful for you, maybe to understand powers of attorney, either being a power of attorney or what, why you should have one. And then the week after, we're doing our Wills versus Trust seminar here in Appleton at the DJ Bordini Center. We do that at 2 o'clock and at 6 o'clock. But you can see a full list of our events and actually register to attend those online if you go to estateplanninglive.com. And otherwise, that was kind of everything I wanted to talk about today. So just thank you so very much for your time. If you have any questions, you can always reach out. You'll get those feedback forms, and